So I think that we can start with this last session. I thank you all for really for the courage to stay 10 hours in this room with us. I hope that you have found so far interesting the debate and the discussions, and you have found some also interesting analysis that we are trying to share to the best of our ability. I again thank you all the speakers because they have done so far a great job, and it's not easy, you know, to put several all the speakers together and to create a red line that accompanies what we have said and analyzed today. That is a very difficult topic. We have the pleasure, and it was part of the arrangement that we have fought with Alberto and Antonio also, to have some institutional investors on this conference. Because in a certain sense it gives some insights about how they look at us, how they look from the trading platforms, the decision of investments, what is happening in Italy and what is happening more in general within the Eurozone. What we have understood, even if with different point of view and perspectives, is that something does not work. At least this is definitely agreed. Then the recipes to face these issues are different, because different are the analysis. And so it's not a surprise that we have different considerations, and that sometimes also we don't agree on what is the other point of view. So I think that right at this point it's a real interesting debate, the one that we are going to do, because all these topics will be filtered by the experiences of people that are on the market, that decides on how to invest money. And in a certain sense, they have to apply the risk-return paradigm, and they have to make forecasts in order to make money. And what I'm not to say, I don't want to say that their forecast will be better than the forecast that comes from the academia, but definitely if they don't reach the target, they will have to change their job, or at least they will have to lose their position and move elsewhere. So there is a sort of, you know, system of incentives and punishments that is concrete. I will start, if Meyrick agree with me, from you,
sure.
In order to have what is your opinion about, also you can move through the topics that we have faced, also to what worries you more, what you think it could be the possible evolutions for the Eurozone and specifically for our country, and try to put your experience and capabilities to share with the audience and with us. Thanks, Meyrick.
Thank you very much, Marcello. I think one of the it should be one of the defining characteristics of an investor is not being sure of themselves. And one of the, whenever you're faced with an investment decision, you have a large number of outcomes, all of which you should have analyzed, and sometimes you have done all the analysis. What I think is particularly interesting about today is that it shows us a huge range of opinions, and it shows us a huge range of uncertainty around the construction of the Eurozone and Italy's place within the Eurozone. If an investor is faced with, and this I think is sort of one of my main takeaways of today, is that if an investor is faced with too much uncertainty or too much difficulty in analyzing where the risks are going to come from, and I certainly think there is a very wide range was exhibited today, then the temptation is to do nothing at all and wait for things to become clearer. The last presentation we had a very useful example of the target 2 imbalances. And yes, of course, they are a technical reflection of the settlement of banking imbalances within the Eurozone at one level. But at another level, they're also an expression of capital flight, or at least they're the replacement of capital flight. And I think one of the things which investors are wary about, and there are many reasons why capital flight is happening from Italy and seemingly from Spain as well, despite its growth. So quite a different country, and yet still got difficulties in its construction of target 2 balances. So there are many different reasons why these imbalances have been created from different structures. But unless we can be sure that at some stage those target 2 imbalances will either halt and moderate, that I think that uncertainty which I mentioned earlier, which is it makes it difficult for international investors to invest heavily in Italy. And I would say that I'm not saying that investors steer away from Italy completely, but I think whilst that uncertainty is there, they will invest less in Italy than they otherwise would. But I started this by saying that one of the things which you've got to have here as an investor is you have to be somewhat humble in the face of the decisions you've got to make. And as you may be able to hear, I'm British, so we're faced with our own difficulties in deciding where we're going to go in future with relation to Europe. And what struck me throughout today is that there are a large number of parallels between the debates we're having in the UK about our future and what we mean and where we're going, and some of the debates that I heard today. And equally, both here and in the UK, I can pick out certain strands of thinking which say that some other people have done bad things to us, or are doing bad things to us, or may do bad things to us. And also there are perhaps some ready-made solutions which we can apply, and these may, in this case that we've heard today, perhaps about fiscal currency, about which I'm extraordinarily skeptical, I should say, for various reasons. I won't say it doesn't work, but the descriptions I've heard don't find very convincing, at least within the parameters of the Eurozone. But in both, particularly in the UK, and I haven't spent very long here, so I'm not sure whether this applies in Italy, but particularly in the UK, what we're finding is that in the debate about Brexit is that we now we're now forced to face our own responsibilities about how we're going to make our way in the world. And that is forcing us, not enough yet, but eventually we will have to decide what we're going to look like and how we can best serve the population of the country currently and in the future in the most effective way. And what very often the most effective way of of serving your population is by initiating reforms yourself without having other people tell you, and to tackle vested interests, people who are difficult to dislodge, people who are going to cause trouble. And it strikes me, I do know Italy a little. I wouldn't say I'm an expert, but I do know Italy a little. And what I do know is that there are things that Italy could do, even without any interference from the Eurozone or from Brussels, whatever, that would make it a significant signal that actually the future of the country is safe within its own hands of the people who run it. And I think that would actually stand in very good stead in debating with other Europeans how Italy stands with relation to them and their relationship with Germany, with Brussels, and so on. And I have some ideas which perhaps we can talk about later, which I don't think are tremendously contentious, and I don't think would bring people out on the streets. And it's certainly, in my opinion, it's not labour market reform, which should be top of the agenda of Italy, although it is for many people. So what I see here really are a series of observations. I think that Europe as a whole is finding some crisis of identity and in direction, which is expressed both in my country and is reflected here. The architecture of where Europe goes next is going to be defined by arguments such as these. But whilst we go through that, I think, unfortunately, that investment is going to be depressed in my country and probably depressed in Italy until we find the route out the other side.
Thanks, thanks, Meyrick. You see that the uncertainty, the word uncertainty, has been quite present in what Meyrick was saying. He's a portfolio manager of Elliott Management, so he's a person that has to decide to create an efficient portfolio and to decide where to put money of his owners, so of different stakeholders. So the point is that it's still uncertainty, and it's not only an Italian issue or Eurozone issue in this moment, because, as you know, we have a problem on a global, actually, basis. And this is actually something that we have to consider for whatever decision or whatever presence we will decide to have within the tables that takes the decision, the critical decision for the Eurozone future. I will ask now, in order, Kenneth Orchard and Massimo Bonansinga, first Kenneth and then Massimo, to offer their view, because, you know, Kenneth is a global fixed income portfolio manager, so he takes care of bond, okay? And in this way, by this way of govies and treasuries, while Massimo takes care of equity. And so he moves on the two main assets that characterize the working of the financial markets. And so, Kenneth, can you share with us your point of view according to all the things that you have heard and hope digested during this long day?
Yes, I'd be very happy to. So I've heard much that I agree with today. Going back to earlier in the morning, there was somebody who talked about the misdiagnosis of the Eurozone crisis as a sovereign debt problem, and rather than a private sector external debt problem. And I entirely agree with that. The creation of the Eurozone fiscal rules that came out of that was a mistake. I think it was caused by a misdiagnosis of the crisis and by some people in the markets, but I think more prominently the Northern European countries. And I think that has caused a lot of problems and put a lot of constraints upon governments and what they can do now, which is leading to more problems over time, although it may have solved a very short-term problem back when they were initiated. Going to Italian debt, more particularly, I see it as sustainable, at least for the foreseeable future. When we look at the sort of general parameters make an investment decision in a government such as Italy. There is a lot of talk this morning about the R versus G and how that's a problem for Italy, but nobody mentioned actually that Italy runs a primary surplus. And because of that, actually Italian debt is perfectly sustainable. The debt to GDP ratio is on a gradual downward trend. Growth in the Eurozone and Italy, growth in the Eurozone is quite strong. Italy, is true, it's weak, but it is positive. The interest on Italian debt has been gradually coming down because of the very low interest rates in the Eurozone. And even if the ECB does start to raise interest rates at some point in the next couple of years, now the fact that Italy's debt stock is so long, it actually, I think the interest rate that Italy pays is going to keep coming down for several more years, because the average coupon on Italian debt is still much higher than where the market rates are. So this is all great for the foreseeable future, but I think Italy and also many other Eurozone countries are in a bit of a vulnerable position, because sovereign debt is rather high, and because you're in a currency union, and so that means that you don't have all the same levers to pull that most governments do. So I think over the long run, unless they want people to have a reoccurrence of crisis or these tensions to come back, then it would be desirable to have some sort of debt mutualization option, which people have talked about this morning. I think the reality, though, is that it has to be some sort of a compromise between what the northern countries would be willing to accept and what and what countries such as Italy are willing to give away. And I haven't actually heard anyone willing to make compromises. And maybe this goes to what Wolfgang was saying this morning about everybody trying to solve the problem through their own national viewpoint. But it seems to me that something like what the Americans did would make sense for the Eurozone. For those who don't know American history, go back to the late 1700s, and you had a number of very strong states and a very weak central government, very weak federal government. And the states had a lot of debt, and the federal government had none, and it had very little ways of raising revenue. And they did a deal where they said, okay, we're going to take all of the states' debt onto the federal government's balance sheet in a one-time deal. And in exchange for that, the states are going to give the federal government some taxation power, and the states were also going to accept some constraints on their ability to borrow in future. And to me, that seems like a rather reasonable compromise that could work for the Eurozone in the long run. But I think both sides need to realize that that compromise is going to be necessary. And perhaps you do hear some people have said that there's no way the Germans are ever going to go there. And perhaps that's possible. I recognize politically this is very difficult. Although you do hear some perhaps echoes of this in some of the things that Finance Minister Schäuble says when he talks about the creation of a Eurozone treasury and what would need to be given up by governments if that was going to happen. The second big problem, though, that's been identified today, and perhaps I think is a more serious one, is the problem that Mr. Flasbeck discussed, and that's the differentials in unit labor costs and wages amongst the two countries, the trends in those, and how they flow through to differences in competitiveness, current account balances, external imbalances, all these things over time. And I think that is something that is potentially could undermine the Eurozone longer term. There's no easy solutions here, and certainly having Germany as a partner in the currency union, I think, does make it very difficult. That Germany, in my own personal opinion, has very fundamentally different notions from many countries about such issues as inflation, competitiveness, wages. If you look at the Deutschmark, it's been a fundamentally strong currency for the last 50 years. It has constantly appreciated before it went into the Eurozone. Everybody, go back to the days of the ERM, everybody devalued against the Deutschmark. Even the Dutch devalued against the Deutschmark. Doesn't mean, though, it's impossible. And I also think this is a fundamental problem with currency areas. And so to some extent, countries just you have to adapt, and you have to bring in other ways of dealing with it. You have to learn, to some extent, to live with it. I come from Canada originally. Canada is a currency area. And if you look at some of the provinces in Canada, then there have been times when they have gone through long periods of stagnation. Look at somewhere like Saskatchewan or Newfoundland, which is on the East Coast. And how you deal with that through transfers, you deal with it through migration. And I think these are some things that the Eurozone can do. But on the other hand, what else can you do? Saskatchewan doesn't say, well, that's it, we're going to leave the Canadian dollar because we think that we could have more flexibility over our monetary policy, and that would allow us to have more flexibility. I think there are benefits and costs that come with the currency union, and countries have to realize that over time. Final point I will make is just going on fiscal currencies. I thought that was a very interesting discussion. And my only concern there is that people seem to be proposing them to have two different purposes. One was that they can provide some fiscal stimulus in the short term, which is desperately needed right now. But then also people are saying, well, but maybe they could also be a new currency. If we needed one, then we could use that as the basis for a new currency. I think the problem with that is, it can't be both. And if it's an open secret that this is the precursor to a new currency, well then you have to follow the logical steps as to where that leads. Put myself in place of an Italian, if I knew that the Italian government was seriously thinking about introducing a new currency and converting all of my euros into some sort of new lira, well then you have to say, how much money are you going to keep in the bank, how much, et cetera. So I just think it's very dangerous to try and think of it as achieving two purposes. So I just keep caution against that, keep it in mind. All right. Sorry, I've gone on long enough.
No, it's enough. Thanks, Kenneth. Yes, I mean, at least there is a hope. We can find a compromise. I hope so. I mean, we will see. But tell, and I repeat, Kenneth gives us a perspective about govies, treasuries, bonds, so this kind of markets that obviously is has a core role within our area. Also because it's the market where we have assisted the phenomenon of the flight to quality. We have assisted to the phenomenon of collateral discrimination. We assisted to the turnover phenomenon for Bund and for OAT within the repo market. So it's interesting that who lives day by day, this market is still convinced that we can bring Germany somewhere, in order to build a Eurozone 2.0. Massimo, you are on the other side. I mean, when somebody wants to take risk in a certain sense, equity market becomes, the first point of reference. Can you share with us, I mean, let's start from the uncertainty. We have moved to the bond market, and then we want to hear from you what is going on.
Well, uncertainty is clearly a problem for the equity market.
Massimo, I think that you have to, or otherwise come here, please. Because maybe that some facilities are not activated there. We are sorry about that.
So I was saying that uncertainty is always a problem also for equities. But one word I would like to add is trust. I mean, it seems to me that there is a big lack of trust within the European Union, and this is because the perception, also in the equity markets, of the Italian government is quite low. Italian government changes too often. This is something that many foreign investors repeat. True or not it is, doesn't matter. And Italian governments are rather ineffective. So I believe that trust building is very important for the equity markets, for Italy as well. And this trust building has to happen through a clear, concise, and direct activity of the government. So we need in Italy a stronger government, a government that is here for 5 years, and that has got a clear path towards innovating Italy. And that means the restructuring of some spending. President Di Maio was correct when he said that basically there is a problem of bad spending in Italy. And this is actually the recipe that I believe is needed to cut the bad spending and either use this money that's saved for more investments or to cut the debt. This trust building is very important for Italian companies because every time they basically interact with investors, they need to have a strong Italian perception abroad to have the investments. But also it's important in relationship to the negotiation with Germany. At the end of the day, we have to do these changes in Italy, not for Germany, but for Italy itself, to improve our effectiveness and competitiveness globally. And this is very important also because a threat, someone evoked the threat of getting out of the euro. This is an empty threat if Italy is not viable on its own. An Italy that has got a more efficient government machine, a public sector machine that will be able to stand on its own is a much more credible threat towards Germany because getting out of the euro becomes viable for Italy and it's not just a measure of desperation. So I think that on the fiscal currency, there are a lot of aspects that I think they have to be outlined with much more detail. I think I agree that to have two different targets for the currency is probably a mistake. Just to stimulate the economy, I don't see that much different from giving the 80 euros and some accelerated depreciation and somehow work on the cuneo fiscale is pretty much same level of stimulus, while instead to create a reserve, a second currency just in case, a plan B, it can be very dangerous because it will be seen immediately as a capitulation and the markets will punish Italian companies for that too.
Thanks, Massimo, to share also the view on the equity markets. And now I will ask Bernd, that is one leading hedge fund manager within the Eurozone, so a person that defines strategies, that studies all the potential opportunities that are in the market, according to the risk appetite that they design to have for their stakeholders. I will ask Bernd to tell us what worries him about Italy's perspective, Eurozone, if he agrees with some of the consideration that we've done, if there is the possibility of improving in his opinion, if really we have to be ready for a plan B, what could happen if this would be the case? You know, in year 2012, in December, actually, the President King of the Bank of England declared, if I remember correctly, it was the 2nd of December, declared UK is ready for a plan B. They were speaking about the euro breakup. You know, somebody has thought that it was just words and freedom. Actually, at that time, if you try to compute the implied probability in the CDS Quanto spread, you will realize, and cumulated with some marginal probability computation, you can realize that we were something like close to 50–60% probability of euro breakup. Because, you know, in the market, financial institution, and Bernd is the right person because you know the financial instruments that are available in the market, they use to buy and sell financial instruments in order to take risk or to hedge risk. I will just give you some examples because otherwise it could seem that the discussions today is, you know, something that has not the feet on the floor, while it's exactly the other way around. You know, within the Eurozone, for example, there are two CDS. The CDS is a derivative that ensures you from the sovereign risk, the default of a country. One settles in euro, and the other settles in dollar. The one that settles in euro is definitely illiquid at the moment, because they trade just this derivative that ensures you from the risk of default of a country, of a member country of the Eurozone, in dollar. Why in dollar? Because for a country like Italy, the Ital exit is quoted very close to the event of Euro breakup in terms of probability measures. And so the distance between these two spreads quotes this event. Another example, there is a general agreement between institutional investors. My friend knows very well the ISDA agreement, okay, the ISDA agreement. These are gentlemen agreements between institutional investors on which they decide how to settle transactions, how to trade. They define also some form, very standardized, in order to make the world faster between financial institutions. We have two standards. One, year 2004, and the other one, 2014, related to sovereign risk. You know what is the difference between the two standards? Is the risk of redenomination. One standard does not cover this risk, and the other yes. And now in the market is quoted what is called the ISDA spread, that exactly estimates the risk of redenomination. There are other tools, I don't want to be boring, but what I'm saying is that the kind of events that under a qualitative point of view we have discussed today are quantitatively quoted by the market. There is somebody that takes risk and somebody that hedges risks. And so it's important that at that time, if you are interested in, I have a paper that describes the implied probability in these financial instruments that I published several years ago on Risk Magazine, that you can see how this implied probability moves. And it moves according to what happens also under a political point of view. As I mentioned in the morning in my first talk, we start in year 2000 with a certain architecture, with one interest rate, with one currency, with some beliefs about the Eurozone that now are broken. In the past, the market was betting on convergence, now is betting on divergence. And now I come to the question that I make to you. An hedge fund manager bets on this kind of big events and try to pick up the bricks in order to implement some profit strategy. And my fear is that in this moment, given, unfortunately, the political framework that does not move towards Eurozone 2.0, obviously they are required to bet on divergence. It's not a question of a speculative attack. They move where they know that they can make money. That is the rule of the market. So, Bernd, can you tell some insights about all these things?
Thank you, Marcello. Yes, as every investor, the basic framework is a risk-reward relationship. And that's the same way of, when I look at Italy, I think as far as the reward is concerned, when I look at Italian government bonds, it's pretty straightforward. As of today, I get 2.1% on my 10-year yield. If I collect this over 10 years, I can compute what my upside or my reward is. Naturally, with most investments, or with all investments, there is some uncertainty, and the risk associated with that investment is particularly uncertain. And I think that leads to some caution in international markets, why foreign investors have not invested or stopped investing in Italian government bonds. In fact, when you look at the data over the last 3 years, there is only one marginal buyer of Italian bonds left, and that's the ECB. Italian banks, which have historically been the largest buyer and cohort of Italian bonds, are net sellers. Private individuals and fund managers in Italy are selling as well. And that obviously contributes in part to some of these target 2 imbalances that we see. But it begs the question, what is the price of a 10-year Italian government bond once the ECB stops buying these bonds? And our assumption is the ECB will, in due course, announce at least the beginning of the end. And in my view, it shouldn't be that uncertain for a number of reasons. First of all, I think Italy is actually a very rich country. You know, household wealth per capita is higher than in Germany. When I look at the primary surplus, it was mentioned a number of times today. Over the last 20 years, the primary balance of Italy looks like that of Germany. However, policy descriptions and most economic forecasts require Italy to become a better version of Germany in order for that to be sustainable. You know, when you look at IMF projections, for example, they require the primary surplus to move above 3%. The average over the last 20 years was around 2%. It also requires growth, something that is hard to come by not only in Europe these days, but certainly globally. And it's not our base case assumption that we have all of a sudden a growth miracle. So my view is that as a result of that, and in the context of some of the political fragmentation in Italy, you have a potential downside to Italian government bonds that is quite astronomical in certain situations. And I think Greece serves as an example where this can end up. And one of the technicalities that was mentioned at some point during the debate today, that is something that concerns us, which is that 96% of all outstanding Italian government bonds are governed by Italian law. That offers the prospect for any government to effectively alter the terms of these bonds, be it by a maturity extension, a coupon holiday, etc., and ultimately altering the value of such bonds. And we believe that is a potential risk, and the risk-reward, when I look at this investment, looks pretty unattractive. And I think capital markets are telling us exactly that. You mentioned that when we look at CDS spreads, the market is telling us there is some risk embedded in these market prices of some form of redomination. When we look at Italian bonds under New York law versus Italian law, there is a small spread priced in. But nevertheless, there is a huge amount of uncertainty, and I think that makes it very unattractive. And the proposals that I've heard here today, many of which are quite interesting, but nevertheless they have one thing in common, which is typically some form of wealth transfer from one taxpayer to another taxpayer. And I think that is a non-starter. In all my discussions in Germany, the door shuts immediately if that concept comes up. And therefore, we've thought about a slightly different proposal, which is effectively based on the idea that this risk-reward is so unattractive, we cannot improve the reward of the bonds because that would increase the cost of interest. We need to take the risk off the table. And the way to do this is to swap existing bonds for new bonds that are then governed by not by Italian law, but by international law. And as a result of that, you take away the optionality to reprofile that debt. Greece had to pay all their outstanding debt that was governed under international law. Even Argentina did after, admittedly, a long battle, but nevertheless they paid. And I think that is a potential recipe to make the risk-reward relationship a little bit more interesting and to attract foreign capital again.
Thanks, Bernd. Now it's quite clear because the debate starts in year 2012 with the collective action clauses, and now, as we have seen in the second session, is moving to the credit participation clause. Because the point is that we have to, in other words, vanish some risk that at the moment is maybe mispriced, according to the policies that are conducting within the Eurozone. Actually, you know that my view is that we have to change some other things. before putting all these disgregation inside our architecture, because otherwise in this way I would immediately change my attitude and cope with Alberto and say, let's speak about the plan B and let's start from now on. I would ask, before giving the word to Jochen and Alberto, that will bring again and close the session under, let's say, a research point of view, I would ask Wolfgang, given his experience and knowledge also of financial markets, to try to, you know, assemble all these pieces together.
Thank you, Marcello. Marcello, thank you very much. I mean, we've heard today a lot of proposals of how to deal with the situation. And they all involve, or many of them involve, some form of default. We don't want to call it by that, but they all do in some form or other. If you start off with the proposal for European Monetary Fund or sovereign debt restructuring mechanism, that has default implicit. Some are more indirect, like SBs. SBs is not a default, but it turns every bondholder of Italian debt into a subordinate debt owner. The proposal for fiscal money, and you know, we looked at it intensely during the Greek crisis, and you know, we got some interesting extra details today. It is a form of default. There's no question. I mean, it makes a difference whether you get euros that you can spend as you like, or whether you get a piece of paper with which you can pay your taxes. For example, a foreigner cannot pay taxes in a foreign country with those documents, and if they ever become traded, they will certainly trade at a discount. And I don't have a problem with default. Default is, you know, it happens. I mean, countries have defaulted many times. But one of the lessons we've had in the Eurozone crisis, and Greece in particular, Greece defaulted on the private sector. But there is a difference between a default that resolves the situation and a default that is followed by uncertainty. So if you want to default, then do it properly. Or don't do it. It's not, you know, don't do an SB or some kind of thing that just gets you to another conference in 1 year, where we're just going to talk about the whole thing again and just, you know, are going to default again. I mean, this is not something one wants to do. I mean, if this is done, and look at investors. Now, investors hate being defaulted on. But then again, they might just bet in the right direction, and once you've defaulted, they might buy again because they see an opportunity. So, you know, the investors' view is somewhat different. That the thing they hate is permanent uncertainty, because that means they simply stay away. And that's the situation at the moment. They just stay away because they cannot figure out the politics of it, and I guess people I speak to here can't figure out the politics either. So they can't figure out, you know, it's very complicated. We've heard a lot of speeches. It was very complicated. So I think the solution has to be clear. Now, I'm not saying Euro exit is the right thing, or defaulting in the Eurozone. I don't know how that works. Frankly, we've worked through so many times during the Greek crisis how to default inside the Eurozone, and nobody's figured it out. Someone's got to explain how that can work, and you need all sorts of other things, but it hasn't really worked. So so one needs to think very clearly of how one does that. I would caution against the idea that to compare this with Russia defaulting or Argentina defaulting. You know, if Italy defaults, and I think, you know, it must, as I said this morning, when something isn't sustainable, it ends, and it has to end. But it isn't the same as Russia defaulting. This is the end of a monetary union. This is the biggest financial crisis you'll ever have seen. This is bigger than what we had in 2008. If Italy defaulted, the various, not just Italian banks, but the entire European banking system would possibly collapse and need complete support. This is something of a completely different scale. This is a financial crisis that is very serious. So, you know, we're not going to be over it in a year and then basically go back to normal. It's just not going to happen. This is big. So one has to be very clear about what strategy one adopts. Since we're here in the Italian Parliament, the one thing I would recommend, I know this has been talked about, I would not put this thing to a referendum. I mean, we've just had the referendum in the UK. UK referendums, not a good idea depending on what you want to do, and I can see the case for that. I can see why you want to ask the people and they haven't been asked. That is a valid point. I agree with that. I'm sorry? No, it's not a good idea. What will happen? What will happen if you put it to a referendum? The problem with this is, is that in the day you do this, you have the markets will force it before the referendum. The problem is it will never come to a referendum. That is the point I'm making. It's not the fact that I don't want people to decide. I have at one point advocated, the possibility of exit. I'm not fundamentally opposed to it. It's not like I'm saying it shouldn't happen. That's why I don't want a referendum. On the contrary, I think it is a legitimate option. Wouldn't be my first option, but I would think it is something I would keep an open mind on. But if you keep an open mind on it, we have to be clear that if anyone does an exit, this is something you do over a weekend, a long weekend. This is not something you announce. This is something you do. You shut the banking system. You secure your borders. You have your military placed around the countries in very strategic locations. You have to have these prints, which we talked about in Greece, which you couldn't find a printer. Now they have to find a lot of printers for that. And it's, printing. It took, I don't know how many years it took us to print the Eurobank notes. Now you might just stamp them. That might be quicker. But this is a big country. You need a lot of lorries to carry the money or whatever it is, the script paper, from one place to the other. You will need the army to actually intervene, not just to fight, but to actually have the physical, logistical infrastructure to get the stuff from one place to another. And we're not even talking about slot machines and coins and physical payment systems. This is big. It'll be the biggest thing that you will ever do. I mean, that's why I think it needs to be, one needs clarity about this, and I would be caution against halfway house solutions. There are intelligent ways of defaulting. And I think one might want to look at, other things of not paying. There may be debt equity swaps. We may be looking at, increasing maturities and other forms. And I think, and I have great sympathy with Heiner Flassbeck when he said today that you should confront Germany. Absolutely, you need to confront Germany, but you need to be credible when you confront Germany. You can't just say, I'm going to get out of the euro and then not getting out of the euro. It's like, better no deal than what is it, British one? Better no deal than a bad deal, and then obviously that works if it's serious. But if it isn't serious, then that doesn't work. So you got to have a plan B. But Germany needs to be confronted. That's absolutely right. The adjustment cannot only happen by the countries, by the southern European countries. There needs to be some equitable. There needs to be an equitable, sharing, burden sharing, and that hasn't happened. I doubt Macron is your partner, and I fear that you have to do that on your own. Because I think Macron is much more likely to team up with Germany rather than against Germany. So I would not misjudge the. I'm sorry. I better end now because.
Oh, but it's fine. It's absolutely fine. It's important to share the difficulty. But I mean, in any case, I would recall also what Wolfgang has said in the previous talk. In my opinion, part of the credibility is also the fact that, but also the fact that we are here and we have arranged in this place a similar debate. All the speakers brought figures, analysis, statistical conclusion, references. The point is that we have to start the debate with different subjects. We have to start the debate in a way that the critical aspects that I believe with honest analysis has been shared today has to be also shared on a European level. Because Wolfgang, you say in the previous session that in order to start, the meeting, in order to have a new Eurozone, you have to bring substance. You cannot say euro yes, euro no. And in my opinion, the kind of analysis that we are developing are exactly in that direction. We have analyzed the issue of the public debt sustainability. We have analyzed, firstly, the issue of the target 2 net balances, the issue related with the CAC in the public debt, as you know. So we opened at the European level the debate of some important aspects of the Eurozone imperfection. I mean, in this room today, there are they have been speakers in this conference, the people that firstly has spoken about these Euro imperfections, not only at an Italian level, but also at the European ones. So I can say that by having this in mind, it is clear that a similar negotiations is something very difficult. But at the same time, I cannot believe that we can speak of a public debt default with a ratio of 130% debt GDP. I'm sorry about that. I found this figure parva res in parva materia. And I don't want to recall the example of Japan that has been mentioned, but that I can also recall the value of United States of America. I mean, I don't know why this figure becomes critical, because the policy decides that these figures are critical. And it's not a joke. You have just to go back to the way in which is then been decided the rule of 3%. The figure comes out as the rabbit from the ceiling there. 60% was the average of the public debt at that time. Now it's 80%. Why we don't change it? I mean, there are some things that seems written in the mermaid. They are written on the paper. You can change with your pen. It's not a must. We have to exit from this angle. I found incredible that large part of the discussion is about debt and not about growth. China is moving. United States of America is changing its policies. Japan has changed 3 times its policies. See the central bank that owns companies. And within the Eurozone, that is still the second most important currency area, we discuss about the SBs. Come on, what we are talking about? I used to be a financial engineering. I know something about derivative and structured finance. I can also make the list, and I have done in an op-ed on FTR, Financial Times Alphaville, also the mistakes that are in the structured finance behind the SBs. And I'm still waiting for the answer to those mistakes. So, I believe that what Wolfgang has said in the second and in this session is very important, because it is the time, 2017, to start a negotiation, despite with the government. There has been created public opinion that moves in this big decision that will be as an X on our heads. What is fiscal compact and the end of quantitative easing cannot be something that has to be discussed within some directive council where we don't know what kind of consideration has been brought in those rooms. And now, as I mentioned, I'm very positive. We write something to the best of our capabilities. We give some results. Please, with competence, say when we are wrong, but not by putting yourself on, in a very high place and say, we are right because we are right, because this is not acceptable. I really want to remind, since Glenn, where are you? Is there, that a minister of economy of a country was required to go out from a meeting of the ECOFIN where they were discussing about the Greek debt. I don't know if this is part of the European democracy. I think that there is a mistake there. But what I know is that Italy plays a role within the Eurozone. The market, remember, the Italy exit is an event, one-to-one relationship with the Euro breakup. This is a fact. This is within those financial instruments that I mentioned you before. And this is a fact of which we have with courage to take the decision, because I like what Answer was saying before. This is not Italian, but I copy everything he said. So I ask now Jochen and Alberto to give us, some further considerations in the light of what all the things that you have said, hoping also that we can find some initial compromise and to find some room in order to start a new road that we can, in which we can walk together, because this is part of the welfare that we are playing for, as Luigi has said in his opening remarks, is the future of this generation that is discussed on the dust of the past. Okay? Yes, Jochen, please come here and get it.
Thank you, Marcello, to give me the chance to direct some words at you for the last time. I think I heard many things here I agree with. I heard many things I very much disagree with. And I still want to thank the organizers for this very useful exchange and discussion here. But let me, rather than pouring oil in the fire, let me share some thoughts that might be more agreeable with. One is policy credibility is an incredibly valuable asset, and you might like international investors taking decisions on that or not, but at the end of the day, that is very much determining a lot of in an economy that's dependent on investment and capital. So to remind, the rollover requirement of Italian debt, it is pretty large, and as I said before, unless we don't change something with the crisis mechanism in the euro area, it will not be possible for that crisis mechanism to stomach a sudden stop of investors in general, if that so happens. So I wish that never happens, and also I think it's not necessary to happen, because I think that's the other point that was made over and again. What is very much key to that is that the country achieves a decent growth rate, and of course you can now discuss about whether it's a supply or demand side issue. I think there's also some agreement here, at least, that necessary are some reforms to achieve that, and that will again reinforce the credibility of the policies. Too much talk, in my view, was devoted to the idea of an exit of regaining monetary authority. Again, my view is don't take it lightly. It's not panacea, and particularly don't fall prey to the simplifiers who think that is a great solution. There's, besides the balance sheet issue that were discussed, there are tons of legal issues. Look at how the UK is struggling. It's going to wreck the balance sheets, as I said. It's going to make households much poorer, and it will be hard to re-establish the credibility of a then independent monetary authority, and to regain, hence then interest rates will probably be higher than they are now. Investment will be harder to finance. And last but not least, and that was also mentioned, tons of simply non-economic issues. Think about global policy and being basically here outside the euro area in this when the winds blow quite heftily. Also, simplifying with some economic engineering, and I think fiscal currency is one of that, It sounds like a great idea because it makes things appear simple to solve. It is not. It is not, and I think some previous speakers have also emphasized that. Blaming others, looking for scapegoats, it's also a great polemic way to go about things. I mean, I like all this conspiracy theory that was espoused here regarding what was the idea behind the euro area. I don't think there's much truth behind it, and I don't think it's helpful in the discussion. So I just hope we find some middle way here. To close, I think, without this being my personal opinion, I think it is useful for the discussion to go forward, to keep in mind some of the principles that have particularly guided German, but also other European countries' policy thinking. One is the principle of subsidiarity. I agree, and it was mentioned here again, if you would mutualize more things, which also means you have to, as I said before, lift the policy decisions to a higher level, to a European level, that could address many things, but principle of subsidiarity basically says to take decisions at the lowest level possible according to voters' preferences, unless there are huge externalities if not doing so. I think defense is a good example where if a small country does its own defense, it's less powerful than if a big group of countries like the EU joins forces in defense. And I think labor market policies or welfare policies in general are just one point. I mean, it's a great idea to mutualize that, and that would give a lot of buffers and shock absorption. But preferences with regard to social policies are just very divergent in the euro area and also in the EU. So I'm not very optimistic that countries would move to a consensus on that. The other principle is liability and control. They need to be on the same level or at least close to that. So any proposal discussed, I think it is useful to keep in mind that particularly my country is very adamant that liability and control remain on the same level. I give an example. Of course, we all agree that the banking union is a great idea. But then an issue comes like with the divergence in insolvency laws, in particular when then there's a crisis and then the rules of the game gets changed, for instance, by different countries introduce moratoriums on repossessions that, of course, lowers the value of bad loans, and then the expectation still is that this national decision is then paid for by other countries. Difficult. The next principle is risk reduction before risk sharing. So we're now at the worst possible stage in the crisis to introduce risk sharing. Would it be much better to do it after the legacies have been resolved or before the legacies even came into place? So some thinking about that needs to be done. And then ultimately, I want to remind you that we are all market economies here. So I think it is, while I have some sympathy for the argument of symmetric adjustment and so on, it's very often not that easy to do. There's limits as to what you can achieve through macroeconomic policy. And I give you an example. I give you one way to look at it. Germany is being called for increasing public investment. Fair enough. Most of that public investment is done on municipal and local level. So the lack there is not the funding. The lack there is the policy capacity to implement that, and to also have certainty over the finances on the local level. So therefore, when the German Council of Economic Experts, for instance, criticizes the fiscal equalization system in Germany, then fixing that basically would give scope, in my view, in our view, to allow on the municipal level to be more public investment be realized. Just as an example of how policy ideas lead into something that I think we all agree should be done, namely more investment. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Jochen, for his words. And now I ask Alberto to offer his further and final consideration after this long day, and then we will have a Q&A session of 10-15 minutes as I promised. So we will be a little bit in delay, but we know that there are several people that want to raise questions for us, and it's right to deserve time to that.
Thanks a lot, Marcello, so especially for giving me the last word, which is it will force me to moderate myself. I will not take advantage of this position. So I will just share with you some provocative thoughts by speaking slowly, because I was asked to do so. Uncertainty. My provocative view is that we have one big and crucial certainty. We can be certain that if something arrives, and I mean if this monetary union, like many others in the history of mankind, collapses, European leaders will arrive to manage this event completely unprepared, because they refuse to even consider this event and therefore to study it. In a sense, what is happening here is a big exception, because we have been asked by a political institution to set up a panel in order to discuss problems and to share scenarios about something that could happen no matter what we wish or we think. So there are objective processes working which can be stronger than our wishful thinking. In this sense, I think that it was a great opportunity to have market economists here, because we had some indications that markets are pricing risks, so they are considering scenarios. And although I am rather a Keynesian economist, academic economist, which is even worse, I must say that in this case, markets behave much better than governments, because they do not refuse to consider possible scenarios, which is quite reassuring for people who, in a sense, give their money to markets. Let's come to the lack of trust issue. So Italian government changes too often. Italian governments are not effective. This issue was raised with different perspective by Massimo Bonansinga, and also in a sense by Jochen Andritzky, when he rightly reminded us of the value of credibility. Now, let's first take the case, the particular case of Italy, of Italian government. So we know we have a bad reputation, and also know that we deserved it. So I will be so extremely. I will not defend the opposite view, but listen. When we were asked to approve the fiscal compact, we were perhaps the first country in Europe to vote in the parliament, and the vote happened very quickly despite having two chambers. When we were asked by the ECB, because it was the ECB that actually asked us to reform our labor market, we did it. We did it. We did it completely, and we did it rather quickly, with disastrous results, as someone had anticipated. But we complied. We were compliant. An argument can be that perhaps we did not reform more. We can't reform more. I have nothing against slavery from an economic point of view. I have something against it from an ethic point of view. But so I would advise to be a bit against conventional wisdom, because it's not a good guide in a period where we are facing threats of an unprecedented danger. And there is another thing I don't agree. So it's not true that there is no solidarity in Europe. There is a lot of solidarity. I take part in a huge number of debate, public debate like this one, academic debates. And I don't want to put oil in the fire, but so every time we speak with German colleagues, they advise us for our best to reform ourselves. Now, if it is true, as I've heard before, that a well-functioning Italy within the Eurozone would be a threat to Germany, I ask myself why Germany is advising us to reform ourselves along the lines it advised. Why is basically Germany asking us to become a threat for it? It's very, 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 very nice, very kind from Germany to give weapons to its enemies. So we are not enemies of German anymore in a military sense as we were many times along many centuries, and we will probably be in the future. Now we are just waging a commercial war in a sense, and something that has always happened. But what has never happened is that adversaries in a commercial war give advice to their enemies of how to be so warned by their enemies. There is a lot of solidarity in Europe. It's something you should not understate. Let's go back now to credibility at the general level. So credibility in general. Much in the same way as I'm advising against conventional wisdom, I would advise against unilateral thinking. So credibility is a good per se, but credibility is not a free lunch. How can we tell the story of the Eurozone crisis? Very simple, very simply. The euro lent to Greece a credibility Greece did not deserve. And for that reason, many international investors, hopefully not those sitting at that table, were lured into lending money to a country that basically did not deserve it. So credibility, it's not always a good thing. It can be a good thing, but it can also be a bad thing. What is always a good thing is prudence. And so be cautious. I appreciated a lot the remark by, as I used to, by Wolfgang Munchau, that default happens. That's true. That's true. Default happens all around the world, as I mentioned before. And this is a very, very deep reflection which we should really think about it, because we are building a completely artificial world, a world in which default cannot happen because otherwise it would be a disaster, or because, I don't know, but default cannot happen. So basically we believe, we Europeans, I am European and very proud of it for a number of reasons that I won't be boring, and I won't make lists of reasons why I'm proud to be a European. But we are building a world in which so basically it shows that we believe to be better than other people all around the world, because we are building a kind of political construct. We are carrying out an integration experiment that nobody around the world has ever attempted to do. So that forget about the United States of America. The United States of America are a big nation state that was built after killing everything was moving and putting there an exogenous, to use an economic word, an exogenous population. So, but there is a thing I'm not completely. Wolfgang Munchau advised us that the financial crisis that would follow a collapse of the euro could be very serious, and yes, okay, we agree. One thing that strikes me, every time people are talking about what happens if the euro collapses or someone goes out for whatever reason, is that they basically assume that it will be a disaster. But basically, listen, we are adjusting since 5 years with more or less success. We had deflation. If a devaluation would occur now, it would be smaller than 5 years ago. Okay, because the competitiveness gap is closing slowly, too slowly. This is exactly the situation in which John Maynard Keynes advised us that in the long run we will all die, okay, because it takes a long run for an adjustment to be completed in that way. But nevertheless, the gap is closing. So whereas the gap is closing, at the same time, the more time passes, the gap closes and the scenario becomes increasingly catastrophic. Why? I don't really see the point. Because now we should devalue much less than 5 years ago. So it's not bound to be a greater disaster. By the way, a disaster can occur also within the euro, and I'm sure that Mr. Munchau could agree with that. I'm not completely sure that I've always been, so I should not say that here because there are five-star movement politicians here, but I've always been very vocal against referendum. So I never thought it was a good idea. Nevertheless, I'm not so convinced that the announcement of a referendum would trigger a major disaster. Look at what happened, for instance, when Marine Le Pen won the first round at the presidential elections. The market disappeared from the newspaper, from the news. There was no turmoil, there was no volatility. So I think perhaps markets are clever than we believe in at least two ways. First, perhaps they anticipate. Second, perhaps they know that if they attack a constituency, that constituency could be tempted to react. And in a sense, this would precipitate the political situation. Just two final remarks. So before Marcello mentioned the unlucky situation in which Varoufakis was banned from. It was not an ECOFIN meeting; it was an Eurogroup meeting. So I know you know, but it's just to make a point. What's the Eurogroup? It's not an institution really disciplined by the treaties. It was born as an advisory body, as with no really, you know the story, in 1997, and basically because Dominique Strauss-Kahn wanted it, because the argument ran as follows: if we don't have something similar to a Eurozone Minister of Finance, people will understand that the ECB rules, basically, without check and balances. This was the argument at that time. It is explained very well by Gian Domenico Maione in his book about rethinking the Union of Europe post-crisis, a very, very insightful book that I advise everybody to have a look at. So now, the Eurogroup, a non-existing institution, was basically entrusted with the management of the crisis. But the very reason why Varoufakis could be left behind the door is that there are no rules on Eurogroup meetings. No rules about people engagement. Yes, about people engagement. And this is a good example of what happens when you design institutions under the pressure of crisis. This is exactly the political philosophy of Jean Monnet. L'Europe se fera par les crises et sera la somme des solutions qui seront apportées à ces crises. Mais en fait, as a matter of fact, when you design such an important and relevant institution only by reacting in a reactive rather than proactive way to crisis, then problems happen. Problems happen, and the problem is that the very idea that governance by rule will ensure stability is very tempting, and I fully understand the attitude of our friends from core countries who do not trust completely our governments and prefer to have a governance by rule. The real problem is that the rule cannot be stable. Rule must be stable in order to be credible, but rule cannot be stable unless you prepare contingency plans. Because if every 5 or 10 years you must cope with a crisis you had not imagined and you change the rules, of course the rules are not stable and they are not credible. If I give you an example, perhaps on this we may disagree. This is how some Italians tell the story of the banking crisis. Germany bailed out its banks, then we were forced to bail in ours. There may be a lot of good reasons why the rule changed. Nevertheless, it would have been much better if rules had not changed. But in order for rules not to change, you must, so within the limit of human intelligence, which is not divine, it's human, you must take into account a number of contingency plans because, so we are now in a capitalist system since, even the Hammurabi Code has some provisions against defaults. Even in the Hammurabi codes, there is solidarity. So this is about corn. If there is a bad harvest, so the creditor must be a bit less harsh to the debtor. So it's very strange that was 3,000 years ago. We cannot believe we are better than the other people around the globe if we are not able to imagine that a crisis could occur, which is something that even Babylonian lawmakers were able to understand and to provide for. That's my point. Very simple point. I always admired technical discussions, but I prefer to stay within more narrow and low-level, low-profile range. So I thank again to Marcello. That were my thoughts on what I heard today.
Okay, now I thank Alberto for his final remarks. I just add one consideration. You know why financial institutions they bet about the events that we discussed today, because they cannot put out from their table the problems. They cannot take time and they cannot avoid risks. They have to manage. So that is the reason why they quote similar events, because they have to take decision every day. What, in my opinion, it has been a big, it's not a question of credibility. I'm sorry about that, I don't believe this. It's a question that we do not face the issues. We do not have a strategy that was 5-year lasting. We have moved in the last year with a 2 months time horizon. And so a lot of decisions that we have taken also within the European institution and with the agreements that we signed declare this. Because as also Alberto has reminded us, some rules has been changed for banks. And we were there to accept this change without a thorough analysis of our situation. And what is more important, because we were receiving some peanuts about what could be our fiscal policy in the next 3 months. So it's important to realize these things. In my opinion, I fully agree with the consideration that has been done from Alberto that Italy is a country that has its credibility in its enterprise world, also in the banking system. The point somewhere is that the politicians and who owns and manage the powers, when a problem is on the table, should face it immediately and not take time and put this problem the day after, the day after, and the day after. And I'm sorry, what we have seen in the managing of the banking system in Italy has definitely declared the absence of any kind of strategy in our country. We start with some solution and then we change the direction. We firstly decide that a bank could be nationalized, and then we change again the idea, and then we change again and again and again. In this way, we create not a lack of credibility, we create the uncertainty. That is a different point. A different point. So, I would I promise from the beginning, during the different breaks, several people say, when is the Q&A session? So, as I promised, I ask the last efforts to the audience to wait other 10 minutes in order that we can receive questions. Only one recommendation, because since I get used to join similar events, these should be questions. For the interventions, the speakers has been selected by the scientific committee and they've given their views. So if you have questions, the speakers is here to answer. If you have your point of view, after the event, we will promise we will be here also to hear your view and also
may I give my definition? A question is a small sentence ending with a curl. Okay?
Okay. The microphone? C'è un microfono per la registrazione? No, non c'è.
Microfono, un gelato volante, non c'è?
Funziona.
E allora
Pronto.
venite qua.
Funziona. Pare di sì.
They told us that now the microphone works. It was not that the case when we asked.
Funziona.
Okay.
Posso?
Yes, absolutely.
Buonasera, uso la matematica da ingegnere, quindi non come i commercialisti che 2 più 2 è circa 4 per mascherare o strutturare la verità e coprire tanti problemi. Noi cerchiamo di scoprire sostanzialmente la verità. Sostanzialmente quello che diceva lei, l'ho detto 2000 anni fa, mi meraviglio perché l'Europa non cambia le regole, non l'ha dato. L'ha detto il sabato non è l'uomo fatto per il sabato, è il sabato fatto per l'uomo. L'ha detto un saggio 2000 anni fa, arrivo alla domanda. Il grosso debito pubblico da cosa viene? Il 60%, c'è un'ipotesi di soluzione, i 2/3 della spesa pubblica sono stipendi e pensioni, calcolate ad capocchiam, scusate la parola, ad capocchiam. Il vero colpo di frusta, come si dice, the shot of whip, flick in English, is to cut 25-30% di questi 550 miliardi, mentre invece adesso i sindacati begin again, trade unions dei dipendenti pubblici, poi verranno gli autoferrotrambieri, poi verranno... È successo tante volte, perché adesso cresciamo del 2%. Dobbiamo avere il coraggio di fare un'analisi degli stipendi pubblici, un libro bianco, che sono dal 25 al 30% più dell'equivalente settore privato in cui io lavoro al sud dove è molto più difficile e c'è un grido di dolore che si solleva. Se non lo facciamo noi, una manovra del 25-30% spostando su 150 miliardi, questo è il colpo di frusta, tagliare anche, con una banca pubblica, tagliare anche i fitti, perché non possiamo svalutare, perché siamo in una moneta unica, arretriamoci noi, abbassiamo il nostro livello, allora la Fiat non va più a produrre in Slovenia, produce di più a Melfi, e questa è la domanda. Una vera manovra economica, un colpo di frusta. Cartago delenda est. Questo è il problema. Grazie.
Una domanda che termina con un punto esclamativo. Beh, una novità.
Dopo la domanda Cartago delenda est. No, abbiamo
Cartago delenda est? Così è la domanda. Guarda la Tunisia, ok.
Ok, Gaetano?
Buonasera, Gaetano Savoca.
Gennaro aveva chiesto la parola.
Non so, mi hanno dato la parola, non me la sono presa.
Sì, sono stato io, scusa.
Perché qua siamo in una diarchia, non funziona.
No. Uno io e uno tu, dai.
Allora, Mr. Jochen ha affermato che per poter tagliare il debito pubblico, una delle soluzioni, certo non l'unica, sarebbe la ridistribuzione del reddito. Allora io mi domando, il reddito di cittadinanza, come vede sono velocissimo, il reddito di cittadinanza auspicato dal Movimento 5 Stelle potrebbe essere una delle soluzioni, non l'unica, oppure un'attività di microcredito ancora più corposa di quella che sta avvenendo adesso per facilitare le piccole e anche medie aziende. Grazie.
Ok, esatto. Alberto?
Io avevo visto...
C'era lui che aveva alzato la mano e poi c'era Massimiliano?
Brevissimo, io ho la netta convinzione che quello che stia accadendo in Europa sia molto dovuto a fattori culturali, con Marcello ne abbiamo parlato più volte. La domanda è la seguente: se è vera questa sensazione, come si può invertire questo meccanismo culturale?
Sempre il microfono per rimanere connessi, altrimenti siamo disconnessi.
Io la faccio molto più breve. Da che mondo è mondo le sorti delle esigenze dei cittadini le hanno sempre svolte il popolo, a partire dalla Grecia e a finire ai giorni nostri. La domanda è presto fatta. Oggi esiste il Movimento 5 Stelle, quello che giustamente mette in primo piano i cittadini, quello che giustamente sta mettendo in attimo il reddito di cittadinanza. Mi spiego e vorrei una risposta precisa, o perlomeno che si avvicina. Ma perché ci ostiniamo a fare sempre i megalomani dell'economia, quando invece è molto più semplice, quando il cittadino assume una sua dignità con un lavoro e con un reddito di cittadinanza? Mi rispondete per favore in questa frase semplice.
Vai.
Buonasera, io sono Andrea del Monaco, mi occupo di fondi europei. La domanda è in primo luogo per Munchau, ma per tutti i sostenitori dell'austerità in modo più convinto. La domanda è se la Germania potrebbe accettare la trasformazione dello statuto della BCE con l'obiettivo zero spread e potrebbe accettare all'interno del quadro di valutazione sulla procedura per gli squilibri macroeconomici il cambio di alcuni parametri fondamentali. Oggi l'avanzo delle partite correnti concesso è più 6 e il disavanzo. La domanda è se potrebbe accettare un'equiparazione più 6 meno 6 o più 4 meno 4 e sulla differenza fra debito pubblico PIL e debito privato PIL se potrebbe accettare un unico parametro. Faccio un esempio: 100% su debito privato PIL, 100% su debito pubblico PIL. Ricordo che in passato, come ricordava Bagnai nel tramonto dell'euro, nel 2012 quel parametro sul debito privato fratto PIL era al 160%, oggi è al 133% sul debito privato. Ultima cosa è se accetterebbe l'esclusione di tutti gli investimenti produttivi dal rapporto deficit-PIL. Quindi ricapitolo: zero spread, equiparazione avanzo-disavanzo delle partite correnti, non più meno 4 più 6 ma uguali parametri, uguale parametro per il rapporto debito privato PIL, debito pubblico PIL, esempio 100 per entrambi, cambierebbe chiaramente l'obiettivo da raggiungere per il fiscal compact. 4. L'esclusione dal computo del rapporto deficit-PIL di tutti gli investimenti. La Germania, Schäuble, potrebbe accettare una cosa simile a condizione che nel caso in cui non l'accetti l'Italia esce fuori? Grazie.
Li facciamo tutti.
I will talk to English if it's not a problem. Anyone can translate? Yeah. I will stand because a wise man once said, "Thou shall stand in front of the masters of the science," and I consider you so. Name is Daniela Lega, 20 years old, from Rome. My answer is, my question is about inflation. Because we listen a lot of things about inflation. We listen that if we going out of the European Union, it will be at 20%, 30%. And more specifically and more scientifically, is it true? Well, can we or must we expect a high inflation if Italy leaves the EU or the Eurozone? And kept in mind that, correct me if I'm wrong, but kept me in mind that an high inflation advantages the debtor, who Italy has a great debtor, but will Italy be advantaged by an high inflation? And if yes, how much? Thank you.
Okay.
Grazie. Daniele San Giorgi, Allianz. Dr. Bagnai, you mentioned before that rules and a system of rules provides some guarantees and can be reassuring, but they need to be reviewed during years. But what if previous rules and the system that we have today were shaped in a way, in a biased way? I mean, the shaping process was dominated by a country, namely Germany, which could have influenced this system in a way that resulted in the problems that we have today. Thank you.
Please.
Allora, la situazione economica dell'Italia rispetto agli altri paesi, in particolare le discrasie tra le diverse situazioni economiche, dipendono dalla mancanza di una politica economica comune tra i paesi europei. Si arriverà mai ad avere una politica economica comune?
The gentleman right over there.
Good evening. I have a question for Professor Minenna. Why are you so sure that the tax would be applied to the Italian debt that is governed by Italian law? I'm not so sure. I've also read some reports from, I think, Morgan Stanley, if I'm not wrong. I'm not so sure that the contracts that are governed by Italian law and it would be decided by Italian tribunals, the tax would be applicable if the government, under the constitutional provision, changes the law according to the Italian civil code.
Clear. Okay. The madam.
Io parlo italiano, non sapevo se intervenire perché appunto ho difficoltà di fare la domanda, però faccio una domanda agli ideatori della moneta fiscale e a Luca Fantacci, che ha parlato di Bancor e di sistema compensativo che sostituirebbe il Target 2, molto interessante, però il Bancor, se ricordo bene, era concepito come una moneta nominale e non come moneta di riserva come attualmente. in modo abbastanza ibrido la moneta attuale. E non solo, ma come lei ha detto, il Bancor sarebbe circolato insieme alle altre monete nazionali. Quindi nel suo progetto io chiedo, ci sarebbe un euro e poi delle monete parallele. E avete affrontato il problema della natura della moneta, in quanto, come sappiamo, dal dopoguerra, da Bretton Woods eccetera, non siamo in un sistema cioè nel sistema ideato da Keynes, che richiedeva una moneta nominale e non moneta di riserva. La seconda domanda, non so se è una domanda o una perplessità, è su quanto ha detto Bernd sulla questione della giurisdizione dei titoli. Io ho fatto un salto sulla sedia, perché lui ha detto tranquillamente che il nostro debito sovrano deve passare di giurisdizione a causa delle incertezze dei poveri investitori. Beh, questo scusate se cioè non so come fare la domanda. Cioè, la domanda è come abbinare questa imposizione, questa richiesta dei fondi con la nostra Costituzione, la nostra Repubblica, la nostra libertà di autodeterminarci, con la nostra sovranità, per non parlare di sussidiarietà.
Gennaro, avevi anche tu una domanda? No, ok. Alberto mi fa gli scherzi. Allora.
Volevo...
Well, I think that...
Marcello.
Okay, because
No.
we run completely out of time, so we will answer the question, me, Alberto, Wolfgang, and Jochen.
I had a comment on Wolfgang Munchau, who made the comments on the proposal of the fiscal currency as a kind of default. Now, I disagree, because we are not proposing to substitute existing commitments in euro with fiscal currency, but rather to use the fiscal currency for creating new commitments. So I don't see why it should be a default. Thank you.
Okay. I will be very, very concise. As regard reddito di cittadinanza, it's quite a plenty of literature. I mean, if we have a central bank that has not a target of full employment, and in our case there is an inflation target, it is really that something similar or that belongs to the idea of reddito di cittadinanza has to be considered. As regard the collective action clauses and Italian debt and the change of jurisdiction, what Bernd said, remember, the institutional investors has to manage risks. So they want, in a certain way, tools and techniques to hedge risk. They don't have a political position or something. They work in the market. They make money, they lose their job, they gain another job, they move to another position. More or less, that is the picture. So the point is that if there is a risk, they have to manage this risk. It's clear that they prefer to not have this risk on the table to manage, because it's a problem. Despite of bureaucracy, Euro bureaucracy, every problem they have to face immediately, and they cannot put this problem 3 years from now. Regarding the collective action clauses, the question is quite easy, unfortunately. If there is an institutional investor that holds more than 30% of that BTP issue, it is clear that you can say, I will redenominate. But since for the way in which the European regulation is relevant and received in our constitution, immediately this hedge fund that has a BTP with the CAC active and that has 31% of that issue can use the Article 700, go to the civil tribunal, and the civil tribunal has simply to act the Italian constitution, and you cannot move, because remember, the European regulation is a first level regulation in our country, for a series of reasons, yes. And I will tell you something more that is relevant at this stage. Think this is the legal aspects that obviously is not part of my analysis, but part of analysis of a group of lawyers that I have consulted. But the question, because I'm not a lawyer, the second point is another. Think about the market, the financial market that sees that you don't respect the EASE agreement. You don't respect the agreement of the ESM that we signed in year 2012, and you force the redenomination to an institutional investor that has the right, since he has 31% of that issue, to block the redenomination. So it's a very big problem for the spread on the financial market. Before the legal aspects, on which, I repeat, also a couple of professor of law on Financial Times has argued more or less what I have said. The point, so, is very different. Is a problem from the market. If you force the rule, the market will punish you, because in that case, you will become not credible. For me, I've finished. Wolfgang, Alberto, and Jochen.
Let me just briefly comment on the questions regarding culture in Germany. I thought the culture question was interesting because they're relating together. The German, and I think Bernd was saying, is the German original design for the Eurozone, when they approved of it, when they agreed that they would take part, was the hope that it would allow ordoliberal thinking to take hold. And this is a philosophy that exists in Germany and Austria and nowhere else. It has no translation, probably many of the concepts in that economic legal philosophy have no equivalence elsewhere. It is as self-understood in Germany by the left and the right as it is completely alien, certainly to Anglo-Saxon economists. This is not comparable to conservative economics for Chicago, so there have been some overlaps in the past, but it's very fundamental. So a lot of there is a lack of a common language. So we see that when we have these debates about the future of the Eurozone, we invariably get into these cultural conflicts about the kind of our fundamental economic beliefs, and the Germans have, and the Italians probably at opposite ends. I cannot reverse. Nobody can reverse that. We've been in the Eurozone for 18 years. It hasn't reversed. In fact, I've observed a strengthening of the ordoliberal determination by German economists in particular. There was, I think, 10, 15 years ago, a greater sympathy for things like debt mutualization. When it wasn't on the agenda, people talked about it as something in principle, but now they become really hostile to it. So, and that answers your questions on I think you asked, the gentleman over there asked 5 questions, and I can easily answer them. There are no, 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 and no. And we can go into the details of which aspect Germany says no to, but these are things that should have been negotiated when they were up for grabs. I mean, there was Mario Monti who agreed to the fiscal compact. Now, we all know Italy will not stick to the fiscal compact because it's crazy. It's completely, it would be impossible. But, the question is, Italy signed it. So why did Italy sign it? Why did Italy not say, hey, no? But now, having signed it, it's very hard to say, let's change some of those numbers. The same with the banking union. Italy signed the banking, all these BRRD directives and translated into Italian law. Again, this was not necessary. The ESM is another example. I mean, the ESM, Italy should have insisted that the payments under the ESM, are deducted from the Maastricht Treaty, let alone investment. But at least, aid payments or Italy's contribution to the ESM should have been completely taken out of any sort of Maastricht relevant, deficit thing. There are, once you sign these things, and there's the Stability and Growth Pact, the Maastricht Treaty, there's no way you can go back to Germany and say, look, let's change the figures. I mean, what they should have said in Maastricht is not 60%, but we stick to whatever the average is, and it's 60% for now, and we review the number every 10 years, and we review the ECB's inflation target every 10 years, and we put some dynamic in, but nobody did that. I mean, the Germans got their way, and my experience has been that Germany pretty much got its way on almost everything in this entire Eurozone crisis resolution system. And it is partly because no one stood up to them. Now the question, this is your last question, what happens if someone stands up to them? Now they're not used to that.
Una sola cosa, il quadro di valutazione è rinnovato ogni anno, quindi i parametri, domanda solo secca, il quadro di valutazione all'interno della procedura sugli squilibri macroeconomici viene rinnovato ogni anno e viene pubblicato parallelamente al country report, quindi quello che lei ha detto sul fiscal compact è assolutamente vero, ma sui parametri sul rapporto debito privato PIL e sul rapporto di debito pubblico PIL e soprattutto sull'avanzo e il disavanzo delle partite correnti che sono asimmetriche, quelle sono sempre contrattabili perché il quadro di valutazione cambia di anno in anno. Il debito privato PIL nel 2012 era al 160%, nel 2016 è al 133%.
I can simply answer they're not negotiable because I mean there was the discussion whether we should impose fines on, and Germany vetoed it. And you know, why should Germany accept a fine to be fined for its 9% current account surplus? Now that they have, I mean, there's no need for this, and Germany rejects this anyway. They think this is a residual. So the current surplus for Germany is not a policy variable, but a residual of some policy outcome that is completely uncontrollable. So no German politician will accept any kind of, you know, again, a completely different perspective on economics. I mean, you know, they say we have the deficit rule, which is now in the German constitution. They follow that rule. The private sector is the private sector, and then, you know, it depends on the private sector and public sectors in other countries too. So, sorry.
Jochen, please help us.
Okay, let me respond from here on a couple of questions that I caught. I mean, cultural factors for me that I'm not fond of. I mean, I can't understand Italian very well, and even though the translation is excellent, I have difficulty sometimes following. I think cultural factor. I think the ordoliberal, having been at the IMF and having been at the Council, which is perceived as an ordoliberal stronghold in Germany, I have to get to understand what ordoliberal means to many that try to put German economists into that corner, because they think similarly about incentives as any other macroeconomist, so I don't understand that classification. I think I don't want to say more to other questions that have been addressed before. I think I just want to add one thing on public investment. The exclusion of public investment from debt or from deficits, it's quite a tricky one. And I mean, we have many professors here on the panel. Do you perceive your salary, isn't that an investment in education and human capital in your country? Should that be excluded too? Should a building or a swimming pool that not adds to productivity in a country be excluded from deficits? It's a very tricky question. What is an investment? What is not an investment? In some countries, like the hospital sector, in France, it is a public sector. In Germany, it's a private sector. So, I mean, where to draw the line? Thank you.
Okay, I think that we have covered. No, non uncovered. Che cosa? Okay. Sorry about that.
Just 1 minute, since it was an interesting question, I will answer in English. Appropriately, the question was, does this proposal in particular, and a lot of our discussion influence the issue of the nature of money? Yes, it does. I've been thinking about this for roughly 15 years, and my answer to this question is money is only important for what it will procure. I used to think this was a quote from Keynes. I discovered that he was quoting Adam Smith. And I believe this is very relevant because, as you pointed out, it's a problem when money becomes a reserve or a store of value. This is precisely why Keynes imagined symmetrical charges on banker balances. This is why we were suggesting, in this case, to apply a rule of the European Central Bank to apply negative interest rates on positive balances in Target 2.
Okay. So, Mr. Vice President, senators, deputies, ladies and gentlemen, survivors, I really thank you for the patience, the attentions, the capability of following similar contents with patience, the patience that you deserve to your country, to our European Union. And I thank all the speakers for the efforts of being available for all this time to this event, and I hope that this event will open a breach in order to reform our Eurozone architecture. Thank you very much to everybody.